Many thanks to Detlef von Daniels for this kind and honorable invitation to speak at these very enriching conferences. There should be distributed a copy of the slides, but I took my freedom to change it a little bit, not very much, but I changed it a little bit so you can recognize it's better to look at the slide in the front or you look for the changes. Third point, I will not start with these isms, compatibilism or indeterminism. These are always, nutshells of opinions, and it seems to be, in my view, methodologically better to put them at the end in some sense, not at the beginning, because if they stand in opposite, that's no argument or no grounding, and even the divisions are not so arbitrary and are not so, without decisions. Freedom seems to be linked in a very fundamental way to modality. However, the question is, how do we have to understand this link? My main thesis will be that freedom should be best defined as non-necessity. This is a main idea, but this is certainly not sufficient. Additional qualifications are required, and these are four, in my opinion. Freedom as non-necessity must be relative, partial, inherent, and involve higher mental faculties. I will explain this main thesis in a first part, and then in a second part I will try to applicate this proposal to the free will discussion. This implies that I will first look at freedom in general and then try to apply to free will. This is also made deliberately. I think we shouldn't cut off the free will debate from the general idea of freedom. This is, in my sense, a way which can cause problems, so I will do this in this way. And the third part will only an attempt to understand divine freedom in this way. I'm not a theologian, so this will be only some sort of proposal for discussion. I don't claim any really good ideas in this third part. Okay, we come to the first part. I think freedom is in a very fundamental way linked to modality. That is necessity, possibility, and reality. But how? I tried to make a modal understanding or propose a modal understanding of freedom. And first we should look at what necessity is in the world. There are different forms of necessity. You all know them perhaps. There's logical necessity, logical inference, modus ponens. There's natural necessity, physical object A falls to the earth because of gravitation. As necessary attraction between physical objects, perhaps causal necessity can be assumed to be a part of this natural necessity. Then there is epistemic necessity. For one sees a tree, one must assume a tree. Practical necessity, duties, obligations, moral, legal laws, and perhaps an additional divine necessity, which is expressed if we characterize God as creator and an almighty being. We don't know exactly what form of necessity, or if even this is a form of necessity. Okay, what is now the decisive idea for freedom? Freedom is certainly in accordance with logical necessity, and the same holds for epistemic, practical, and divine necessity. So it can only be natural necessity, especially causal necessity, which is meant when we assume that freedom is non-necessity. So if we assume that freedom is non-necessity, this means it's non-natural necessity. It's certainly not non-logical necessity or non-practical necessity or non-epistemic necessity. However, what does this mean, and how strong is it to be understood? This depends on our understanding of natural necessity In what way is natural necessity in our way? One could say there is some sort of sea of natural necessities. This is only a metaphor. It is not only local, occasional, ephemeral, but in the whole world and permanent, ubiquitous, at least since the Big Bang. So it is not restricted to a certain part of space or time or space-time. It's a sort of sea. This is only a metaphor. If we come to a stronger position, then this is a well-known strong determinism, and since now I could evade to introduce some ism, but now it's inevitable. And strong determinism goes, or seems to go even further with two theses. Natural necessity is in one and only unity. There is no plurality of independent necessity, no pockets for other independent necessities and other modalities. This is this causal closure thesis. Professor Kraschl showed it yesterday, and even other speakers who talked about necessity, so about determinism. So this additional thesis, it's not only necessity, because necessity can be different plurality of necessities, that it's one and only unity of necessity, and this is an all statement which by definition cannot be verified. All statements about the nature cannot be verified. Second, all states of affairs in the world are the outcome of this one and only unity of natural necessity. There are some doubts about strong determinism. We saw these all these 2 days, and I will go over it very quickly. I'm not an expert in this field. This is a quantum mechanic doubt. One finds indeterminism, non-locality, observer participation. Then a second point is chaotic processes. In the last talks, there was some discussion if chaotic processes are indeterministic or deterministic. I'm, again, not an expert in this field. I'm interested what the experts would say, but I experienced that between the last speaker and some participants, there was a discussion if chaotic processes are deterministic or not. A third point, which I want to make a little bit stronger because it has not gained enough attention, is biological life implies some self-development and self-preservation with logical reduction of entropy, which is based, local reduction of entropy, which is based on additional, not only physical forms of necessities and other modalities. And there seems to be no violation of physical laws, but no one and only necessity which determines everything in this part of life. This is what I learned from some natural scientists or biologists. Again, I'm not an expert, I can just refer this. These are the doubts about strong determinism. And now I come to this understanding of freedom. What do I mean when I say freedom is non-necessity? There are 4 additional qualifications I will now explain. The first is it is relative non-necessity. It means here in relation to the different ubiquitous sea of natural necessity. So this non-necessity seen is relative. It's not absolute. It's relative to this surrounding sea of natural necessity. Second, it is only a partial non-necessity, not a total, because a total non-necessity would imply that there would be no necessity in the world at all. It cannot be a total non-necessity that would make this claim of non-necessity senseless. So there must be some natural necessity which, relative to this, we can assume freedom as relative non-necessity. There's a weaker, this thesis is weaker as a classical assumption of freedom as some power, potentiality, faculty, autonomy. So we can assume that these things are some explications of freedom or some instantiations of freedom, but I think it's not necessary to understand freedom to understand it as power or autonomy. Now, non-necessity implies possibility according to modal logic, but also reality is a form of modality. See Kant and many others. It is not only possibility. We cannot translate non-necessity simply to possibility, as some modal logicians would like to do. This is always their proposal. We can replace this by possibility, but according to Kant, we have also reality as a modality, and perhaps there can be another independent necessity. If non-necessity is understood as relative non-necessity, there can be another independent internal necessity, and this is a major point of my idea or my proposal. Perhaps this is weird, but I try to think it through. What means inherent within the ubiquitous sea of natural necessities? This partial relative non-necessity is dependent on the specific object which is characterized as free. So this non-necessity is inherent, that is internal to the object, not external. This is a point already Daniel von Wachter made in his presentation. I think this is not very controversial. So it is not only given to the object or emerging in an external process of change. So particles in quantum mechanics are undetermined, but they are not free in this sense, because there is no understanding, as I have understood, that this non-necessity of particles in quantum mechanics is internal, has its roots in each of these particles. It has its roots in the whole process, but Professor Bergman knows it better, perhaps can correct me. These hold at least for specific acts of the object, so it is possible to assume that God has created man with its property of freedom, but it would not be possible to assume both freedom and that God necessitates externally all singular human acts. Then human beings could not have this internal non-necessity. And the fourth condition, which is important to understand freedom, is that this definition is still too broad, because it includes all forms of life, like plants and bacteria, because their self-determination and self-preservation is beyond purely physical necessity. So life is an additional self-referring system, so it's also a relative partial inherent non-necessity. Therefore, we need another condition. This means higher mental processes. So we assume only freedom if this non-necessity depends on higher mental processes. So the result of this proposal is freedom is partial, inherent, higher mental, relative non-necessity. I hope this is not too complicated and after lunch and it comes close to freedom. Perhaps there are other conditions. I am happy to learn about any other or improvements of this proposal to capture the idea of freedom. Does this imply that freedom is in itself not a form of necessity? No. I already said this. It must only be non-necessity relative to external natural necessities. That means it can be additional characterized by being a form of inherent necessity, supernatural necessity, for example, by a soul, agent causality, as Daniel von Wachter proposed it, or even a local different form of natural necessity, for example, by processes in the frontal cortex of the brain of a human being which are internal and self-referring. I think in order to prove the non-existence of free will, it's not enough to show that our decisions are dependent on our brain processes. We should also show that the brain processes are dependent on the whole universe, determinism, natural necessity. And this would be, in my view, also not so easy. This is one possibility. So what is the result? We have three possible progressive levels of freedom. A basic level where freedom is possibility. This is a stadium of attempt. I'm free already if I have this possibility to talk or not to talk. I don't have to perform it. Then there's this realization level. Freedom is reality as realized. attempt. And then there is this, or can be this normative level, there is some additional inherent necessity to progress from one possibility to reality. And there can be different possibilities, for example, a genetic program or the internal moral law to do moral actions. This can be possibilities. I think also Daniel von Wachter's proposal as agent causality is an additional internal necessity in a form. And this asks then the question, isn't this decision only a decision by chance? Okay, this is nearly the first part. I think our self-understanding as free is based fundamentally on the openness of these three levels. We think that it is up to us to progress from possibility to reality and to obey practical necessity, especially this faculty or possibility to obey practical necessity seems to be some sort of phenomenon which in our view grounds our self-understanding to be free in decisions. Now I come to some discussions. The principle of alternative possibilities seems to me to be too strong. It is, according to the famous Frankfurt article, the possibility of alternative actions that a person could have done otherwise. This is too strong and does not hold. Why? Because it excludes every external additional necessity which can come up. These are some of the Frankfurt cases, but also every internal necessity. This is the point. If you demand, and this is the trick of the proponents of this principle, they propose a very strong principles, and by this they can kill free will. This is a very simple and well-known trick in philosophy. First, you propose a very strong principle and show then that the opposite position you want to kill does not come up with it. I think we should already refuse this principle because it excludes some sort of internal necessity if we assume, for example, it is necessary for us to have this necessity of the moral law, or even if it is necessary for us to have internal some other forms of necessity. For example, a thought which is compelling. If a thought is compelling and compels us to do a decision, then you can say you don't have any other alternatives, but nevertheless, this is a free action. So Frankfurt's old critique of this principle seems to me mainly justifies, but this deserves certainly additional discussion. This is the first part, and I now come to the step to apply this for the free will discussion. My basic thesis is here there is no entity or substance of free will. Will is only willing. That is only one specific form or part of our mental process. And we have to understand which form or part of our mental process willing refers to. And I sometimes feel in this whole discussion, people assume that will is like a billiard ball, and then another billiard ball hits it, and this picture should be the same to understand our mental process. But this is certainly not the same. Willing is only one part of this fluctuation of our mental processes, which is not a sort of physical object or an object. And we have now to look in which part of our typical actions and decisions we find willing and partial relative inherent higher mental non-necessity. And I now come to a picture of these processes, of an ideal processes. In one you find here some conditions, internal values, feelings, virtues, external, community, profession, general laws of nature. These are some necessity, but not a decisive necessity for some beliefs and desires. On this stage we have beliefs And desires, we had already the discussion with Professor Swinburne about the role of desires. I assume with this picture that the desires are necessary, but they are not always the end of the story or even decisive. They can only be some sort of motivating vehicle without content. And the real content comes from beliefs which are in itself influenced by some values or the idea of the moral law or the highest good or the idea of good. Then we have some intentions, goals, aims. We search for means. And then here we have willing. Willing is a selection of some means, which then is the last step to the action in the narrow sense. This is the action in the wider sense, and this is the action in the narrow sense, and then the consequences. So we have here on point 5, we have this mysterious, I would say, part of our mental process, which is willing, or called will. But there is a lot of things before this step 5. There is also these 4 other steps which are decisive. One could say these 4 steps are reasons, and one could assume that all steps are linked by a form of internal conditional necessity. All these little arrows show some sort of necessity within the mental process. If you say, like Professor Swinburne said, desire necessitates the next step, I wouldn't say the last step, but the next step, then this is a sort of necessity in this mental process which is going on. Okay, what is now freedom in respect of this model of action, the parts of an idealized action? If there's no, I think the freedom of acting, the non-necessity of acting, not the freedom of willing, is if there is no decisive external intervention between step 5 and 6. So if I go back to 6, if there is no decisive external intervention, we can say the action as step 5 is free because it is according to the willing. That's familiar ground, and I think nobody would question this. But the next point is a little bit more problematic. Freedom and non-necessity of the will, of willing, if there is no decisive external intervention between steps 1 to 4 and 5. If you look again at the model, if there is no external decisive intervention before this point, before willing, in 1, 2, 3, or 4, then one could say this action is, if there are higher mental faculties, is free. At least this is my proposal. And I think that Frankfurt's theory of the free will, in the second famous article, the concept, freedom of will and the concept of a person, is in this respect quite true. He says a person is free to will what he wants to will. That means this before the willing, and he says second order volitions are effective desires concerning his first order will effective desires. This understanding of the high mental non-decisive freedom is true, but still I think far too narrow. I would say Frankfurt made a decisive step in understanding free will, but this is not the final word, because to assume that on the second level behind the willing is our only second order volition, this is far too narrow, because the pre-willing mental process includes a lot more elements which are part of a cyclical process of self-referring coherence. So I would refuse the narrowing down of these steps 1 to 4 to these effective desires. This is clearly the Hobbesian Humean English tradition, and I admire it as I admire all English-British culture and philosophy, but I disagree in this So step 1 to 4 include not only affective desires, but also values, feelings, beliefs, intentions, aims, and a search for means. All these elements are part of a recursive, self-referring mental process in order to reach some willing. And we assume that the extent, duration, and course of this mental process is grosso modo in many cases up to us. For example, when we reflect for weeks on all advantages and disadvantages to take a new job. So the examples which prove or which show that we assume freedom are not the immediate decisions, which are for a clear reason always taken as counterexamples. The liberal examples are immediate reactions to some sort of sensations, or if I see some ice cream and I immediately grasp it, I can say, okay, this is perhaps not free or very limited in freedom. But if I deliberate for months, if I should take this new job and I have come to some sort of desire and have found some means to get the job, but then I go back and have some additional reflection, I think about the values which underlie this job changes, and shouldn't I change these values if I take the job only if it has a higher salary? And a second thought gives me, no, this higher salary is not decisive. It is decisive to have more time for reflection and philosophy. This is another recursive step which shows that in this cycle of steps 1 to 4, we go forth and back and change our beliefs, our desires, our intentions. If we look, for example, for some means and we realize these means are very bad and would cause other bad effects, then we change our desires and our beliefs and our games, and even we change sometimes our values and virtues and feelings which base the beliefs and desires. So the process seems to be very much more complicated as sometimes we think. And one can call this steps 1 to 4 a reason. So this is my understanding what some people like Daniel von Wachter call reason. What is the reality of free as general property? The whole process 1 to 5 can take place without decisive external necessity. There is no better proof of the reality of free will than this reality of this higher mental process which is performed by us and leads to willing, and we assume that we are, it's up to us to stop this process or put it in another direction or limit it or frame it or divide it in different steps of processes. The suspension of the exercise of free will can take place in singular cases, and I will mention some of these suspensions or reductions. And I've forgotten to say that there is some extent. We can say free will comes in grades, and if this process is very reduced, step 1 to 4, it's a lower grade of freedom. If it's very extensive, we experience a higher grade of freedom. Now to the suspensions in singular cases. If a decisive part of this process 1 to 4 is lacking, which is described, for example, in criminal law, mental illness, disorder, or defect in consciousness, if somebody cannot form realistic beliefs or cannot act according to his values. Second point is external force, which forces people to a willing, for example, torture. This suspends, I think, in some sense, free will. If people are indeed forced to form some sort of willing to make a confession or whatever. And third, and perhaps a little bit more debatable, external deception, which causes a false belief in this process. If there are decisive false beliefs in these processes, we wouldn't say somebody is acting really free if I'm deceived about the qualities of a car I want to buy we would say, okay, this is not really a free decision. And this suspension of the exercise of free will can be effective gradually. This was the second point, and I now come to the third part, the most problematic part, because I'm not a theologian. I'm only giving some material for discussion here. If man is created in God's image, then God has at least the same mental faculties, this non-necessity. Therefore, he has free will in the same or even a higher form as man. But if there is no natural necessity which necessitates God, then it makes no sense to describe one of his properties as non-necessity. So it makes no sense if there is no natural necessity which necessitates God. Therefore, it makes no sense to describe God before the creation as free or having free will. This makes no sense if there is no natural necessity which is a sea of natural necessity around God, whatever that would mean. The only way out would be to say, with respect to God, we understand this non-necessity of freedom not as non-necessity relative to natural necessity, but relative to logical necessity. We could say if God is even free from logical laws, in some sense he has some sort of logical non-necessity, and this is a form of higher divine freedom, which is, in my opinion, not open to human beings, because we cannot be free from the necessities of logic, of standard logic. After the creation, there is some necessity which, the question is there some necessity which necessitates God? If not, then there is no sense to describe God as free as before creation. Though this is the question, is there some natural necessity, or, as I already mentioned, perhaps some logical necessity? Only then it makes sense to attribute freedom to God. And now the final point of my talk. Only in all determining God would exclude free will in humans. This is a familiar point. But I think if one takes the Bible as some expression of God or other holy scriptures, then it would make no sense by God to obligate human beings. For example, in the Garden of Eden, don't eat from this tree. That would make no sense if he would not assume that human beings are created by him as not totally determined by his actions. If he would assume, or she, that he always determines every single act, it would make no real sense to issue obligations, which are not logical necessities or natural necessities, but this is a practical necessity by God. It's the same as with the pact with the Israelites. And foreknowledge is also, I think, no determination. You know this discussion. For example, Haskell in Oxford Handbook of Free Will shows this. Divine foreknowledge is not the cause of human action, because you have to distinguish between knowledge, foreknowledge, and determination. This seems to be a clear, necessary distinction. Many thanks for your very kind attention. I'm looking forward to discussion.
Yeah, I would like to make only a few comments. First, where are you? Here. on your notion of natural necessity, which is important in your definition of freedom. Secondly, on your definition of freedom as some kind of non-necessity that is related to natural necessity. And thirdly, on the power of doing otherwise when it comes to free will. So one of your first theses is, we are sure that there is necessity in the world. To be honest, I'm not so sure, you mentioned 4 kinds of necessity. First, logical necessity. I would say so far so good, but is it really in the world, in the empirical world? This might be disputed. Secondly, you mention epistemic necessity. You say if it appears to me that there is a tree, then it's necessary to assume that there is a tree, but I cannot see that this is necessary. So if it appears to me that I see a tree, then it's just necessary that it appears to me, or that I think it appears to me, maybe, but not that there is a tree. Thirdly, you say there's practical necessity. It's not clear to me what that could be. Maybe a kind of conditional practical necessity in the sense, for example, insofar Peter wants to realize X and M is the only means to realize X, then necessarily Peter has to choose M if he wants to realize X. However, I don't think that the issue of practical necessity is crucial for what you suggest. Fourthly, you mentioned divine necessity. However, you didn't explicate what you mean by that notion. Instead, you just gave 2 examples, God's omnipotence and his being the creator of the world. With respect to these examples, I was surprised that you didn't distinguish between metaphysical necessity, like in the example of omnipotence. So some people might say it's metaphysically necessary that God is omnipotent, is kind of essential property of God. And on the other hand, it's not necessary that God creates a world, or it might not be necessary. So then this is not a necessary, metaphysically necessary property, but a contingent property. Finally, and most importantly, you mention natural necessity. But again, it's not clear to me what you mean. So, I've already mentioned there's maybe something like physical necessity, metaphysical necessity. How does it relate to natural necessity? A few further questions. If it is always possible that a power, let's say a non-physical power, interferes in the cause of natural causes and effects, how can we say that there is natural necessity? Maybe you mean that there is causal necessity if a physical event A, given that no other power interferes, must, under some circumstances, cause another event B. Maybe you mean such kind of conditional necessity, I don't know. So the question remains, is there natural necessity in the physical universe, or shall we rather say that there are physical entities that have objective dispositions and tendencies to behave so and so under such and such conditions? So much to the notion of natural necessity. It appeared to me that there is a tension in your proposal. On the one hand, you want to say that freedom has to do with a kind of non-necessity which is related to natural necessity. So the tension I see is that our brain processes are in some sense a causal natural processes, or are causal processes, and in that sense you might say they are natural processes, I don't know. But on the other hand, the same processes shouldn't be totally determined by natural necessity, as you suggest. So how can we, or how can you harmonize these 2 aspects, realms of reality? Then you say, so another point, I'm not so sure whether non-necessity, which is related to natural necessity is in any sense necessary to define freedom. I think we should distinguish between freedom of action, freedom of will, and maybe freedom in the sense of a harmony between first and second order volitions. And I tend to think that none of these kinds of freedom necessarily presuppose some kind of relation to natural necessity. I try to give a little counterexample. We can say that God has freedom of action, so he can do what he wants. For example, create a world if he wants. Secondly, we can say that God is either free to create or not to create, or he was free to create or not to create, and has in this sense the power of free will, the power of doing otherwise. And thirdly, we can say that there are no conflicting volitions in God. So in this sense, he has got this freedom of harmony between his standards, his reasons, or whatever it is. Come to my last point, the point of free will. One of your theses was that there is no power of doing otherwise, and you say the principle of alternative possibilities is too strong and doesn't hold, and you rely on Frankfurt. I personally do not think, or I don't see, that Frankfurt has convincingly shown that the power of doing otherwise is not necessary for exercising free will, or that he has shown anything which is somehow a threat to the principle of doing otherwise. So I see two main possibilities. One is, if the choice takes place somehow in our brain, then what Frankfurt might have shown is that a person's brain process, or that a person's brain processes might be manipulated in such a way that the power of doing otherwise is blocked or cannot be exercised. But that doesn't show a lot, I think. And on the other hand, if the choice doesn't take place in the brain, but in a non-physical area, let's say in the soul, that initiates a brain process, let's think of this choice event, then the power of wanting something rather than something different has already been exercised in the core, so that any manipulation of neuronal brain states or processes comes too late, because the free decision is already made. Yeah. You argue that the principle of alternative possibilities excludes, first, every internal reality, because if a possibility is made real, then there is no alternative possibility. And okay. Yeah, I didn't understand that. So, to sum up, I would like to discuss with you and the plenum your notion of natural necessity. I tend to think that it needs further qualification. Secondly, if it is at all necessary to relate freedom to natural necessity. And I don't think that that freedom of the will, I think that it implies the power of doing otherwise, and that the Frankfurt cases don't show a lot. So these are the points I want to suggest to discuss. Thank you.
Good and stimulating questions and opinions, and I admit that there are many questions open in my proposal. I took the modalities, necessity, possibility, and reality as some sort of foundation or axiomatic. I didn't try to go deeper into metaphysics. I have to apologize for this. This is would be very difficult and would open up a total different discussion about what is modalities. We would transfer our discussion, our conference, into some sort of very deep ontological conference. It would be necessary, I agree, to do, but was not possible. Natural necessity can be explained in, as you said, in the world. I would say, it's, and you said empirical assumption of logical necessity. I would say no, logical necessity is not something which we have some sort of empirical knowledge, and perhaps also for natural necessity. This is true. We have perhaps some empirical evidences when an apple falls down. This is some evidence that we have. There is some natural necessity. But this is no proof. It is a sort of attempt to characterize this metaphysical notion of necessity a little bit further into divisions, and we can assume that yes, practical necessity is some sort of, you mentioned it is perhaps dependent on some willing of the person who is coerced by practical necessity. I would say, according to Kant, this is not the case. The categorical imperative does not depend on some aim which I want to attain, and therefore exists a hypothetical imperative. Divine necessity is a territory I'm very unfamiliar, and perhaps all of your criticism is true. I don't find metaphysical necessity very helpful. I have to admit, I skipped this metaphysical necessity because I'm totally dubious about the notion of metaphysics. I think this is only sort of divisionary concept for branches of philosophy or branches perhaps of academics, but has no descriptive content. Natural has at least a descriptive content in comparison to or in distinction to logical necessity and epistemic necessity. One could say all these other two, epistemic and practical necessities, are not really necessities, because epistemic necessity is not decisive. We can be deceived. It's clear we can be deceived, and practical necessity is not has not this condition we assume for factual necessities, that necessity requires reality. Factual necessity requires reality, but practical necessity don't requires reality. So many questions, and I cannot do everything. But last point before we come to discussion, perhaps to the question of free will. My main point is it would not hinder free will if the example is this, that if somebody acts in a certain way, there is an external manipulator which brings me always back to the way he has decided to act. This would not hinder to say I act freely, and this was one point of the Frankfurt example, to say this unqualified principle of possibility alternative, which does not divide between internal and external. This is too demanding, and I think this division is decisive. This is the main, or one of the main messages, and it's already in this proposed definition of freedom, that it must be inherent to some sort of external necessity, and deliberately this principle of possible alternative is too strong because it pulls down this decisive decision which is necessary for free will. This is my point. If I'm manipulated in my brain internally, then we can say, okay, then this is not, there's no free will anymore, because then this process 1 to 4 is not going on in a normal way, which is going on when I exercise free will. So though I would hold this critique of this principle that it is too demanding. This is my response. Many thanks.
How you understand a decisive external intervention, particularly in relation to a process of moving towards agency. I'm very sympathetic to your thought that we want a sense of freedom that extends further up the process than Hume and Hobbes allowed for.
Yeah.
But how does it do that? So I'm deliberating about what to do. I want to heat some water.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for means, and I see the kettle is on by the sink. So I form a belief that's decisive for what I'm about to do, given all my desires and everything. But it seems to be part of the normal functioning of a internally driven process towards a goal. But at the same time, it seems to involve a fairly decisive intervention from without through my sensory organs. The kettle imposes itself on my senses, and I cannot but believe that there is a kettle there. And it seems to be, it may even be an external necessity. That seems to be a possibility with all sorts of beliefs that can be involved in my determining an action. What do you want to say about that sort of case?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Pink. I was vague in saying at this. Sorry, no, it's. The thing is no. Sorry, I'll come back to. Yeah, here it was. There's no decisive external intervention between steps 1 and 4. And if I go back to my proposal, I would say, okay, if your idea is at this point, if I see the kettle and the kettle is decisive for me to grasp it and put it on the oven and to heat it. Yeah. I would say this is not an accurate description of the mental process of a human being which is after a certain age. If I show an ice cream to a 1 or 2 year old, yeah, he will grasp. And I know this is for every parent, this is an easy way to manipulate. And I remember the point where this stopped working with my son. Then I knew it would be much more difficult to educate him and handle him. But if you would say, as a description to the woman or the man who takes the kettle from to put it on the oven, you are necessitated by this kettle standing there. He or she would say, no, I'm not necessitated by this standing there because I can take the other one, because when I see it or I just reach out with the hand and grasp it and feel now the iron is corroded or whatever, and I don't want to take it anymore because it is it is dirty, and I don't like this tea in this kettle because I see now it has a lot of rust or whatever. So this necessity is not really, cannot be decisive, because I'm fully under control to change my mind about this means. It's only a means for me. I'm fully under control to change my mind.
Then my question is going to move to what you want to say about the possible freedom of the belief itself. Because it looks as though you want to talk about a higher mental non-necessity extending to items, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4 at any rate. Now, again, I'm not unsympathetic to the idea of a freedom of belief, but under what conditions do you enjoy it? Because even if the belief doesn't necessitate my action, someone might think that the kettle and its obviousness through my sensory organs has necessitated the belief that it is there. And so there's going to be an awful lot of absence of non-externally imposed necessity in my beliefs, or maybe not. And what would you want to say about that case?
Yeah, that is some sort of epistemic necessity, which was criticized by my respondent, and we all know. Yeah, but I wouldn't deny that it actually sometimes happens. I said that some actions perhaps are not free. If I'm in the evening, I'm tired and in some sense willing less, and somebody puts an ice cream in front of my eyes, I reach out, and I wouldn't be sure to call this a free action, because. But these are only some actions, and the most of the actions are more complicated, and I feel that I can, go beyond these immediate epistemic necessity which causes some belief. I can either say, after this belief is formed, that the kettle is there, oh no, I changed my mind, having the kettle in my hand, I think I don't want to prepare tea, just I prefer to call a friend or whatever. So this is one point. Or I can question. Remember Descartes' famous example at the beginning of the Meditations, where all external beliefs are questioned. I think it is internal to our learning as mentally sane adult or persons to know that all external induced epistemic beliefs are subject to error and qualification. And so this is part of our freedom, that we know that all external beliefs have to be questioned and can be questioned.
Yeah, thank you for the very intriguing talk. I have two very short questions. First one is that you say after creation, you say foreknowledge is not determination, but my question is, doesn't foreknowledge require determination? If there is no causal freedom, and if there is only contra-causal freedom, how can God have foreknowledge? And the second one is, you said that God before creation, it doesn't make sense to say that he's free. Your commentator said that he's free to decide whether to create or not to create, and we could also come up with other scenarios. He's thinking, he can decide to think about numbers, or he can decide to think about beauty, or whatever other options that you might have. I just didn't understand why God is not, we cannot say God is free before creation. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's a second question. Very good questions again. I said perhaps we have to, and perhaps this point is questionable at the initial definition, that this freedom isn't only directed as non-necessity against natural necessity. I said at the end, perhaps with respect to God, we have to enlarge this and say, with respect to God, it makes sense only as non-necessity in respect to logical necessity. If the question is, what does it mean that God is free to create the world? Perhaps he has. We assume. Do we assume that he creates it only by chance? This is the question. Do we assume? I'm not a theologian, so this is ice. I'm walking now on it, but my question is, as far as I understood the theologians, or I read, they say this is not by chance. It is some sort of internal perfection or whatever. And if you say this is internal perfection of God, or is an advancement of his prior steps, then you assume some sort of decision which can be qualified, and the question is, should it be qualified as free? And I would say it makes only sense to qualify it as free if there is some point of necessity which brings it to a sense that, so you say, none. Freedom is a concept which is none of something else from some sort of necessity. This is the main messages I want to bring over. And if you have no negation to some sort of necessity, it makes no sense to speak of freedom. And one argument in this debate, also I'm not an expert in this, is that we have some sort of foreknowledge. For example, I know when I showed my son the ice cream that he would grasp it, but I didn't determine him in some sense. Determined him in the sense I pull a handle or whatever. I showed him the ice cream, and I had foreknowledge that he would do, but this is to be distinguished from force him to take the ice cream or determine him to take the ice cream. I think this can be one is factual and perhaps sort of practical, and the other is purely cognitive, and this is a distinction.
Yes, thank you very much. I was not at all convinced by your rejection of the principle of alternate possibilities, and I would like to ask you a question to help me better understand your argument. Would you accept a version of PEP that includes moral tracing cases? Comment on that. Almost no one today defends a naive version of PEP, because what you mentioned, there is some kind of internal necessity. Sometimes we are determined by our character, by our habits, by what we think best reasons are. However, we can be still morally responsible for something where we do not have the power to do otherwise, if there was in the past a situation where we could have formed our character otherwise, or where we culpably neglected to gain information. And that is what constitutes the moral responsibility of something. So that is actually kind of like a rational or good version of the principle of alternate possibilities that respects internal necessity. Would you accept that kind of version of PEP?
If a principle is criticized, and there are arguments that it doesn't hold in a more extensive sense, and the usual game of philosophers is to reduce it a little bit and then propose it again. So this is.
No, sorry, that's not a game. That is like 30, 40 years of the advancement of research.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I'm not an expert in this PEP discussion. I don't find it. I have to admit I'm not so convinced that these discussions should be followed for a lifetime. Same as for the Gettier cases. If there are people who just discuss everything in Gettier cases, if you admit that this is a reduction of the old principle, I would say. Okay, if if you say it's enough for an alternative that I was able, alternative possibility, I was able to change my character. This is your idea. I was able to change my character. I would say, okay, this is something I didn't exclude in this picture. I said freedom of will constitutes in some sort of recursive processes in this from 1 to 4, and this can also go back to 1. So I, at some point, I understand that, for example, if I have the desire to buy a Jaguar car, I'm indeed a fan of Jaguar cars. I already mentioned to Dr. Schwind, since many years I have the desire to buy one of these wonderful XJ98 cabriolets, and this is a desire I have for many years. But I know this is a luxurious desire. It will cause a lot of trouble because these cars need a lot of maintenance. And perhaps sometimes I come back to say I will not only change this desire, but to get over this desire, long year desire, I have to change some sort of value which is in some sense inclined or virtue to this sort of beautiful British classical cabrio sports cars. And I would say, okay, if I have this alternative possibility to change this virtue that this is a good thing to have these cars or protect them or drive them, then this is some sort of freedom. And I would say, okay, in this reduced form, I could accept PEP. And if you say this is an advancement of the discussion, then PEP has reduced itself to this model of freedom of the will.
Yeah, just a quick question about your notion of internal necessity. Didn't quite get that. Are you saying
what
that
necessity? Natural.
Internal necessity. So are you saying that free actions are internally necessitated?
I didn't exclude this. This was one of the main points. I didn't exclude it as some other do. I would say this was one of the outcomes of my proposal. If you say freedom is non-external necessity, you can assume to be free even if you have some sort of internal necessity. And this can be different forms. For example, if you say your belief or desire is internal necessitated by some conditions. And this desire necessitates some intentions and then causes some willing. I would say this doesn't exclude free will because this internal necessitation is not can be in reality with the non-necessity in respect to external natural necessity, for example, gravity or whatever. So I wouldn't exclude necessity in this wider sense. I said in a wider sense, which includes also epistemic necessity and practical necessity. Yeah? If you would exclude practical necessity, Kantian moral law, then there would be a contradiction in Kantianism. You would say Kant says people have free will, but they are necessitated by the moral law, which would be a contradiction. So my proposal is we shouldn't exclude necessity. We should look at it. It can be so overwhelming or so strict that we assume that this process is distorted, is not going on anymore in a sufficient manner. And then we would say, okay, this person is not free anymore. Perhaps some mental illnesses. If the mental illness is so severe, and this is also in criminal law, when they say, okay, the guilt of the criminal is not decisive, is not proven, and so he shouldn't be convicted, then this assumption is that this process is not going on anymore in a sufficient self-recursive and yes, steered manner by the person. He's only subject to his internal drives or his, and then we would say he's not guilty of this action because he's mentally